The Obashi Foundation Course, Lesson 5, Elements and Layers. Welcome to Lesson 5. In this lesson, we're going to study Obashi elements and layers in more detail. We'll start with elements before walking through the ownership, business process, application, system, hardware, and infrastructure layers one by one. Once the layers of the Obashi diagram have been drawn, elements are added to them. These elements are the building blocks of a bit diagram. Elements represent an organization's assets or resources, whether they are physical or non-physical. Elements could, for example, be a role, an application, a server, or an operating system. Your organization might refer to elements as configuration items, entities, or artifacts. Elements are drawn onto the bit diagram as a rectangle. They might be manually hand-drawn or added using a tool. The length of the rectangle will vary, as you can see here, depending on how many other elements it links to. Some elements might even be squares. This is perfectly okay. Remember, Obashi has 6 layers for an element to be placed within: ownership, business process, application, system, hardware, and infrastructure. Which layer an element is placed in tells us what type of element it is. Once an element has been placed within a layer, it becomes associated with it. This means it has its first relationship. An element in a layer is implicitly associated with that layer. Elements can be repositioned within a layer, but they cannot be moved to another layer. A system element can never become a piece of hardware. An application can never become a business process. Elements must be contained within their layer and cannot be resized beyond it. If an application element, for example, was resized so that it overlapped into the business process layer, it would no longer be clear what type of element it was. Once an element has been placed on the bit diagram, it will be given a name. For example, ownership elements might be named after business departments, such as the sales and finance departments. It's good practice to define a naming convention before starting to create bit diagrams, so that everyone understands exactly what is meant by a name and how an element should be named. One question that is frequently asked is whether an element can exist more than once on the same bit diagram. This is acceptable and is practical for a number of reasons. Firstly, repeating an element can make a bit diagram clearer, perhaps by simplifying connections between elements. Secondly, it can add context to a diagram by establishing additional relationships. Thirdly, this technique might be used to make the bit more visually arresting and underline a point. Can you think of any other reasons why an element might be duplicated on the same bit? If the technique is applied, each instance of the element must have a unique reference. We'll add a diagram to your study guide for this lesson that shows an example of multiple versions of the same element on one bit. Elements have some specific characteristics. An element type is dictated by the layer in which it is placed. An element in the application layer is an application element. An element cannot be connected to every other type of element. It can only connect to those in adjacent layers. No element can connect outside of its adjacent layer, so a hardware element can't connect to an ownership element. And finally, elements of the same type can connect together to form a hierarchical structure within a layer. For example, a hub, a switch, and a router might have a hierarchical relationship within the infrastructure layer.